First up, we're going to explore some of the impact and learning from the independent evaluation of an advisory group, which was carried out by Matter of Focus. So I'm going to ask Sarah Morton and Helen Berry to join me on the screen. Hi both, it's great to have you with us today. I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Carol. And hello, everybody. It's really lovely to be here today. I'm Sarah Morton from Matter of Focus, and this is my colleague, Helen Berry. And we were selected by the advisory group through a robust selection process to carry out this evaluation and also to work with the filmmakers that made the film that shares the findings from the evaluation. Just to say a little bit about Matter of Focus, we're a purpose-led company and we're on a mission to help organisations understand and track the difference they make. We're not going to talk in detail this morning about the methods we use for the evaluation, and you'll know that there's a full report, a summary report and some case studies available from the Life Changes Trust that go into that detail if you're interested in it. What we are going to do instead is give you a sense of how we work and what's important to us in the way that we carry out our evaluation, and some of the key areas of impact we set out to explore in this evaluation. And then we're going to pick out a few golden threads in our learning that we'd like to shine a light on for today's session. At Matter of Focus, we believe in working side by side with people to help them set out and understand how their work creates change. And that meant, in this case, both with advisors and the staff team at Life Changes Trust. We use the headings that you see on the slide to provide a simple framework for exploring different journeys towards change. So the sort of change where it's really based on people, it's inspiring or educating or empowering people, and numbers alone can't tell the story. We use these headings to set out what we call a contribution story, which creates a line of reasoning from the things that you do as an organisation or a project or initiative through to the longer term outcomes. What difference does it make? And then that story becomes a framework to shape and collect evidence and to refine the story and really build the evidence behind it so we can show that it did happen and also really highlight the key elements of the change. We use this approach with all of our organisations, but in this case, it was to understand the work of the advisory group. And I'm going to pass over to Helen to say more about that.
Okay, so this slide provides a visualisation really of the different areas that we looked at as part of this evaluation. So it shows how the kind of methodology that Sarah was talking about was applied in this particular case. So we looked at three areas. The looking in to the bottom left was the part of the work that faces inwards. So this was about exploring the journey of the organisation, the culture, the processes, the practices, as well as the personal and the professional journeys of the advisors and of staff members. The looking out piece at the bottom right was really around how the work influence the wider world of young people with care experience. And there were two main change mechanisms here. So one was around policy and practice influencing, and the other was the co-production of individual grants programmes, which Carol mentioned earlier. Finally, we constructed a further contribution story almost on top of those, if you like, and we called that lifting up. So this was slightly higher level and more abstracted. And we created this with the group, I should say, as well. And it was really a kind of learning piece. So it was bringing together what we had learned about co-production through this work in a way that would make it more shareable for other people taking forward similar work in other settings. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of an idea of the phases of this piece of work. So we've worked alongside people in this work for about 16 months, and we'll say a little bit more later about how we involve people. I think the fact that we had 4 years' work to reflect back on just really helped to kind of make the work as rich as it was. Actually, it was really important. What I'd like to do now is to share a few reflections on some of the golden threads that Sarah mentioned. So these are the sort of threads that are woven through the story and help us to understand why things have played out in this particular way. And I'm going to do that by using a small selection of quotations. So we had some beautiful quotations as part of this work, and I think they really, they speak so powerfully. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about the looking in part of the work, which is where we map the journeys of staff members and advisors separately. And something that was really interesting was that although we mapped these journeys separately, the journeys actually mirrored each other to a significant extent. So they showed how people might enter this sort of journey, this co-production, having to work through some initial anxieties and then coming to commit themselves fully as human beings to the process. And similarly, at the end of the journey, feeling part of some kind of movement for change, having been quite strongly influenced by this way of working. Both staff and advisors reported the profound impact of the work on themselves, both personally and professionally. And there was this strong sense of enjoyment and pride that ran through, and I think you could see that in Simone's expression at the beginning in the film there. And we just felt that, we could sense that all of the way through this work. We could also see that although advisors arrived in the room because they had this lived experience of care at some point in their lives, in practice they brought forward many identities and experiences and developed new ones, and their involvement went so far beyond that personal individual experience. And I think that idea of bringing yourself as a whole human being, because the advisors brought themselves as whole human beings, it really encouraged staff to commit themselves more wholly as well. So it was quite an energising force, I think. Something, I think what the quote on the slide is really getting to is this kind of power of not starting with the individual personal experience as something that was a real kind of jewel in the work, was that it was forward looking. It started out with what people could contribute and where they wanted to go as a group, rather than asking people to tell their story, which obviously happens so often in this field in particular, I think, but it really was this forward-looking agenda. I'd like to say just a little bit more about what we thought it took to develop this particular way of working, and again, the tone of the relationships. I think something really important here was that there was space for the work to be genuinely shaped. There wasn't a set agenda at the start. Also, this was work with a very tangible and direct influence on other young people, particularly through the individual grants programs, and that was just so motivating for people to be involved in. Another important aspect of this work was the willingness to invest in the people. So that might be funding for development, training, paid work, where that was appropriate and where the role was, it was a very particular role that was maybe comparable to what a paid team member might be doing. So there's a lot of reflection around what should be paid and what should be voluntary in this piece of work. Overall, I would say we found good evidence that the investment and the opportunities that young people got from being part of this group did make a positive contribution in terms of their own individual personal outcomes. So a final couple of reflections on the relationships work that this work takes. Number one, it's not easy, especially at the outset. And I think the relative consistency of this group over time has been really important in just how productive they've been able to be. It really does take time and investment to do this work well. A common mission is so important in carrying people through. And finally, I think as this slide indicates, we heard the sort of language that people used around the group, using words like friendship, home, family, connection. And that language really shines through this work. You know, it was a group that people wanted to be part of and felt good in, and that was just such a sort of powerful force within the work. I've talked a little bit about some of the outcomes for the advisors themselves. I'd like to say a little bit about outcomes for the organisation. This is difficult, I think, because the whole point is to embed or integrate a way of working, so it then becomes quite difficult to call out the outcomes. However, qualitatively, we noted people consistently using language like integrated, enriching, grounding, the idea of a wider conversation, more creativity, more energy, a greater focus on what matters. These sorts of words to capture the difference that the work makes. And I think as this slide suggests, this is a cultural thing, and it's about having a culture of working that supports the co-production, and that's just so important. I wanted to briefly mention the wealth of external influencing work that the group has done. So this is the kind of looking out piece that I mentioned at the beginning. We pulled together 5 case studies, as Sarah mentioned, of external influencing work. So I would encourage people to look at those if you would like to find out more. But there were some overarching threads to these case studies. Together, I think they underline how impactful the advisors have been as advocates for care experience. And they also show how the work has contributed to the voice of lived experience in different ways and places. And they show how advisors have contributed to collective campaigns and system developments within the sector. Our own reflection was that actually this piece of work was really interesting because it made us think slightly differently about what influence means. So rather than thinking maybe so mechanistically around policy influence, say, that actually the individual voices in this piece of work were just so strong, and the individual advisors were so strong. And I think it really helps us to think about what it means to be personally impactful or influential in our interactions with others. And I think that's what's really captured in the quote here. Finally, I wanted to say something about how the advisors were involved in the evaluation and how we worked together. So as was mentioned earlier, they were involved in constructing the brief and interviewing us, assessing our application and so on. So I think that sort of set up a very particular way of working with the group. This was another piece of work that was commissioned prior to COVID, but then took place during COVID. So it required a complete pivot for everyone who was involved. And I think it was a testament really to the quality of the relationships and the working practices in the group, and the commitment of those involved, that we were able to work and have some of the really deep conversations that we had actually as part of this piece of work, and able to do that well within the evaluation. And I think, you know, the advisors' kind of involvement in things like analysing the data as well as sharing their experiences of the work really helped to add kind of depth and richness to the final reporting. I'm going to pass back to Sarah for some closing reflections.
Thank you very much, Helen, and I hope that gave you a bit of a snapshot of the project we've been doing, and it's been really fascinating to explore the way that the advisory group became such an integral part of the Life Changes Trust, and the wide-ranging impacts on the advisors themselves, but also staff and the sector. And for us as evaluators, it's also very exciting to have a film made of our findings, so it can be communicated in lots of different ways. We're really pleased to be here to celebrate this work and to highlight the difference that bringing lived experience in, when done well, can make to people and to an organisation, and in this case, to a wider sector. We'd like to really thank the advisors in particular for working alongside us, for being patient while we figured out how to do things in this very different virtual world, and also to everyone else who contributed to the work. And so I'm going to hand back to Carol now. Thank you.